The most dangerous person in prison is usually the one nobody notices. The lunch bell echoed through Green River Correctional Facility as hundreds of inmates moved toward the cafeteria. Trays rattled against metal counters. Conversations bounced off concrete walls. The room carried the familiar sounds of another ordinary day. At a small table, near the far corner, sat Samuel Carter. At 72 years old, he looked like the last person anyone would pay attention to. His shoulders were slightly bent with age. A pair of thick glasses rested on his face. His prison uniform hung loosely from his thin frame. While other inmates gathered in groups, Samuel sat alone with a paperback book beside his tray. He ate slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Most people passed him without a second glance. That was exactly how Samuel preferred it. Across the cafeteria, however, a different kind of attention was beginning to form. Brandon Cole entered with several members of his circle. Conversations shifted as he walked through the room. Some inmates looked away. Others watched carefully. Brandon enjoyed being noticed. In a place where reputation meant everything, he had spent years building his. He laughed loudly, spoke confidently, moved through the cafeteria as if the entire room belonged to him. As he approached the serving area, one of his companions nodded towards Samuel. A few quiet jokes followed. Several men laughed. Brandon glanced across the room. His eyes settled on the elderly inmate sitting alone. "Who is that?" he asked. One of the men shrugged. "Just an old guy. Keeps to himself." Brandon looked again. Samuel had not even glanced in their direction. The lack of reaction seemed to irritate him for reasons he could not explain. Most people noticed Brandon immediately. Most people adjusted their behavior when he entered a room. Samuel simply turned another page in his book. Minutes later, Brandon and his group carried their trays toward a nearby table. Their path happened to pass close to Samuel. The cafeteria remained crowded. Chairs scraped across the floor. Inmates moved between tables. Everything happened quickly. A careless bump. A sudden movement. A brief moment of confusion. Samuel's glasses slipped from his face and fell onto the concrete floor. The sound was small, barely noticeable, yet somehow the entire moment felt louder than the surrounding noise. Several inmates nearby looked down. One lens had cracked. The frame was bent. Silence spread through the immediate area. Samuel stared at the glasses for a few seconds. His book remained open beside his tray. Across from him, Brandon watched with a faint smile, expecting anger, frustration, or at least a complaint. Instead, something unexpected happened. Samuel slowly reached down and picked up the damaged glasses. His hands remained perfectly steady. He examined the frame carefully. Then he folded the glasses and placed them beside his book. No argument. No accusation. No complaint. He simply returned to his meal. The reaction confused everyone watching. One inmate frowned. Another exchanged a puzzled glance with his friend. Brandon remained standing nearby. "That is it?" he asked. Samuel looked up. His eyes seemed softer now without the glasses. "That is it," he replied. The answer sounded calm, almost peaceful. Several men laughed awkwardly. Brandon waited for something more. Nothing came. Samuel picked up his fork and continued eating. The cafeteria slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed. Trays moved. Chairs scraped. Yet something had changed. People kept glancing toward the old man in the corner. Not because of the broken glasses. Because of the way he handled them. As Brandon walked away, he found himself looking back one more time. Samuel was already reading again, holding the book slightly closer to his face. No anger. No resentment. No embarrassment. Just quiet focus. And from a table near the back wall, an older inmate who had witnessed the entire scene suddenly lowered his coffee cup and stared at Samuel with growing concern. Unlike everyone else in the room, he was not surprised by Samuel's reaction. He was surprised that Brandon had chosen Samuel at all. The older inmate who had been watching from the back of the cafeteria remained seated long after lunch ended. His name was Walter Hayes, and unlike most men in Green River, he rarely paid attention to everyday prison drama. Yet he could not stop thinking about Samuel Carter. As inmates carried their trays away and correctional officers directed traffic toward the exits, Walter continued staring at the empty corner table where Samuel had been sitting. Something about the old man's reaction felt deeply familiar. Not normal. Not ordinary. Familiar. Across the room, Brandon Cole and his group walked toward the housing unit. The incident should have been forgotten already. In prison, dozens of small conflicts happened every week. Most disappeared from memory within hours. Yet Brandon found himself replaying the scene. The broken glasses, the calm expression, the complete absence of anger. He could not understand it. Most people reacted when something important to them was damaged. Samuel had simply picked up the glasses and continued eating. It was as if the event meant nothing at all. Later that afternoon, Samuel sat alone in the prison library. Without his glasses, he held a large print book closer than usual. Sunlight filtered through the narrow windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The library remained quiet except for the occasional turn of a page. Samuel seemed perfectly content. No complaints about the broken frame. No requests for sympathy. No effort to attract attention. Meanwhile, Walter entered the library and stopped when he spotted him. For several seconds, he simply watched. Samuel eventually looked up and smiled politely. "Good afternoon." Walter nodded. "You should be upset." Samuel seemed confused. "About what?" Walter pointed gently toward the damaged glasses resting on the table beside the book. "Those." Samuel glanced at them. Then he smiled again. "They are only glasses." Walter shook his head slowly. "Most people would not see it that way." Samuel closed the book. "Most people spend too much time protecting things and not enough time protecting their peace." The answer lingered in the air. Walter stared at him. The words sounded simple, yet they carried unusual weight, like something learned through decades of experience. Not theory, experience. Before Walter could respond, the afternoon count announcement echoed through the building. Inmates began returning books and preparing to leave. Samuel carefully stood, tucked the damaged glasses into his pocket, and thanked the librarian before walking toward the exit. Walter watched him go. The feeling returned immediately. Recognition. Somewhere in his past, he had seen that composure before. That discipline. That patience. He just could not place it. Across the facility, Brandon spent the afternoon in the recreation yard. Several members of his group joked about the lunchroom incident. They expected him to laugh along. Instead, he remained distracted. One of them finally noticed. "You are still thinking about the old man, aren't you?" Brandon shrugged. "Maybe." The others laughed. "Why?" Brandon looked toward the fence line. "Because none of it makes sense." The answer surprised even him. As evening approached, Samuel crossed the yard on his way back to the housing unit. A basketball rolled unexpectedly across his path after drifting away from a nearby game. Without breaking stride, Samuel gently stopped it with the side of his shoe and redirected it back toward the court in one smooth motion. The movement lasted less than a second. Most inmates never noticed. Walter did. So did Brandon. Neither man said a word. Yet both found themselves watching Samuel disappear through the doorway. The motion had looked effortless, precise, almost practiced beyond explanation. And for the first time since the glasses had broken, both men began asking themselves the same question. Who exactly was Samuel Carter before he became an old man sitting quietly in the corner of a prison cafeteria? The next morning, the broken glasses became one of the most discussed topics in C Block. Not because damaged glasses were unusual. They were not. What puzzled people was Samuel Carter himself. In prison, reactions created reputations. Men remembered insults, arguments, and grudges. Yet Samuel had treated the incident as though it were a passing rainstorm. The calm response lingered in everyone's memory. During breakfast, inmates quietly exchanged theories. Some believed the old man was simply tired of conflict. Others thought he was afraid. A few insisted neither explanation felt right. Walter Hayes listened from a nearby table without joining the conversation. The more he thought about Samuel, the less convinced he became that fear had anything to do with it. Fear left traces. Hesitation, nervous habits, defensive behavior. Samuel displayed none of those things. Across the cafeteria, Brandon Cole sat with his usual group. Every few minutes, someone mentioned the old man again. Normally, Brandon enjoyed being the center of attention, yet somehow the conversation kept drifting towards Samuel. That fact irritated him more than he cared to admit. Finally, one of his companions laughed and pointed toward the far corner. Samuel had entered the cafeteria carrying a replacement pair of inexpensive reading glasses provided by the prison. The frame looked plain and slightly oversized. Samuel simply collected his breakfast tray and sat alone as always. Brandon watched carefully. There was still no sign of resentment, no sign of anger. It was as though the previous day's incident had never happened. Later that morning, inmates moved through their normal schedules. Some attended classes. Others reported to work assignments. Samuel spent several hours in the library reading near a window. Without realizing it, he had become the subject of observation. Men who previously ignored him now found reasons to pass by. Some nodded politely. Others stared for a second too long. Samuel appeared unaware of all of it. Around noon, a small crowd gathered in the recreation room where several inmates were watching a televised sports program. Walter happened to be there when an announcer began discussing the career of a retired martial arts champion from decades earlier. The segment lasted less than 2 minutes. Most inmates paid little attention. Walter froze. Something about the athlete's posture triggered a memory. The way he stood. The way he smiled. The image vanished before Walter could fully grasp it, but the feeling remained. He leaned forward in his chair. A strange sense of recognition settled over him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, pieces were beginning to move. That afternoon, Samuel crossed the recreation yard carrying a library book beneath one arm. A strong wind swept through the facility, scattering loose papers from a maintenance cart parked near a building entrance. Several sheets lifted into the air. One drifted directly toward a puddle near the walkway. Before anyone else reacted, Samuel casually reached out and caught the paper between 2 fingers without breaking stride. The motion looked effortless, natural, almost automatic. He handed the paper back to the maintenance worker and continued walking. The entire moment lasted less than a second. Most people would have forgotten it immediately. Brandon happened to see it from across the yard. So did Walter. Neither man spoke. Yet both noticed the same thing. Samuel moved with unusual precision. Not the precision of a 72-year-old inmate trying to get through the day. The precision of someone who had spent years training his body to respond without hesitation. As evening approached, Walter sat alone on his bunk replaying every strange detail he had witnessed. The broken glasses, the calmness, the basketball, the paper caught in midair. None of it proved anything. Yet together they formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, several cells away, Brandon stared through the bars of his own cell, thinking about the same man. For the first time in a very long while, both men shared a common question. And with every passing day, that question was becoming harder to dismiss. Who exactly was Samuel Carter before Green River Correctional Facility ever learned his name? By the end of the week, one fact had become impossible to ignore inside C Block. Whether people liked him or not, Brandon Cole controlled the attention of the housing unit. When he entered a room, conversations changed direction. When he laughed, others laughed with him. When he decided someone deserved attention, that person usually received more of it than they wanted. For years, that influence had remained unquestioned. New inmates learned quickly which groups held power. Older inmates learned when to stay quiet. Brandon understood this system better than anyone. He had spent years building it. Yet lately, something felt different. The source of that feeling sat quietly in the prison library reading books through an oversized pair of replacement glasses. That afternoon, Brandon occupied his usual table in the recreation yard. Several members of his circle surrounded him. They discussed sports, prison rumors, and upcoming work assignments. Eventually, the conversation drifted towards Samuel Carter again. It always did. One man laughed and described the way Samuel had calmly picked up his broken glasses. Another mentioned the paper Samuel had caught in the wind. A third brought up the basketball incident from earlier in the week. Brandon listened without speaking. The stories sounded insignificant on their own. Together, they created a picture that refused to make sense. Across the yard, Samuel sat alone on a bench beneath a shaded awning. A library book rested open in his hands. He occasionally turned a page. Nothing about him suggested importance. Nothing suggested mystery. Yet more people seemed interested in him every day. Brandon finally stood. The conversation around his table stopped immediately. Several inmates watched as he crossed the yard. Others subtly shifted their attention in the same direction. Samuel did not notice. Or perhaps he noticed and simply chose not to react. Brandon stopped beside the bench. The older man finished reading a paragraph before looking up. "Can I help you?" Samuel asked. Brandon folded his arms. "You always sit alone?" Samuel glanced around the yard. "Not always." Brandon looked at the empty space beside him. "Looks like always." Samuel smiled faintly. "Maybe people are busy." The answer drew a reluctant grin from Brandon. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved gently through the yard. Somewhere near the track, A correctional officer gave instructions to a maintenance crew. Finally, Brandon nodded toward the book. What are you reading? Samuel turned the cover slightly. Brandon recognized neither the title nor the author. Any good? He asked. Samuel considered the question. It depends. Brandon raised an eyebrow. On what? Samuel closed the book. On whether somebody wants entertainment or wisdom. The answer sounded sincere. Not clever. Not rehearsed. Just sincere. Brandon found himself unexpectedly curious. Which one is it? Samuel smiled. That depends on the reader. Several nearby inmates had begun paying attention. They expected tension, conflict, some kind of confrontation. Instead, they watched an elderly inmate discuss books with the most influential man in C Block. The scene felt strangely out of place. Brandon eventually shook his head and laughed. You never give a straight answer. Samuel stood slowly from the bench. Sometimes a straight answer arrives too early. Then he tucked the book beneath his arm and began walking toward the housing unit. Brandon watched him leave. For reasons he could not explain, he felt less irritated than before. More interested. Much more interested. Near the fence line, Walter Hayes observed the entire exchange. The growing mystery surrounding Samuel no longer felt accidental. People naturally gravitated toward him despite his efforts to avoid attention. That evening, as inmates returned to their cells and the corridors grew quiet, the same question continued spreading through Green River. Not who controlled the prison. Everyone already knew that answer. The question now was why an old man with broken glasses seemed completely unaffected by any of it. The following week brought an unusual shift to Green River. Samuel Carter had not changed. His routine remained identical. He woke early, read whenever he could, ate quietly, spoke politely, yet somehow the attention surrounding him continued growing. The mystery had become impossible to ignore. Even inmates who had never spoken to Samuel now recognized him on sight. Some watched him openly. Others pretended not to. Samuel appeared completely unaware of the interest. Early one morning, Walter Hayes entered the library before most inmates arrived. The room was nearly empty except for Samuel, who sat near his favorite window reading beneath the pale light of sunrise. Walter paused for a moment before approaching. Mind if I sit? Samuel looked up and smiled. Not at all. Walter settled into the chair across from him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Walter leaned forward. Have we met before? Samuel seemed amused. In this prison? Walter shook his head. Before here. Samuel closed his book carefully. I do not think so. Walter studied his face. The answer sounded honest, yet the feeling of recognition refused to disappear. You remind me of someone, Walter admitted. Samuel smiled softly. Hopefully somebody respectable. Walter laughed. The conversation ended there, but the question remained. Somewhere deep in his memory, a connection waited to be discovered. Later that afternoon, Brandon Cole noticed something else that made Samuel stand out. During recreation period, several inmates gathered around a table playing cards. A disagreement broke out over a rule. Voices grew louder. Nothing serious. Just the sort of tension that appeared regularly in prison. Before correctional officers even looked in their direction, Samuel happened to walk by. He did not raise his voice. He did not insert himself into the discussion. He simply paused and said, "Everybody wants to be heard. Very few people are listening." Then he continued walking. The argument ended less than a minute later. Brandon watched the entire thing from across the room. He frowned. Samuel had not solved the disagreement. Yet somehow his presence seemed to change the energy around it. That evening, Brandon found himself thinking about the old man again. The realization annoyed him. For years, he had been the person everyone watched. Now he was spending his own time watching somebody else. Meanwhile, Samuel sat alone in his cell repairing the arm of his replacement glasses with a small piece of tape. The task required patience. His hands moved carefully and steadily despite his age. Across the tier, another inmate observed him for several moments before shaking his head. "You ever get angry?" he asked. Samuel looked up. "Sometimes." The inmate laughed. "Could have fooled me." Samuel adjusted the glasses and placed them back on his face. "Getting angry is easy. Then why do you not?" Samuel considered the question. "Because most things are not worth giving away your peace." The answer spread through the housing unit before lights out. By now, Samuel's words traveled almost as quickly as prison rumors. Some men laughed at them. Others wrote them down. A few quietly thought about them long after the conversations ended. As darkness settled over Green River, Walter lay awake staring at the ceiling. He kept replaying fragments of memory. A sports arena, bright lights, applause, a familiar face standing calmly while everyone else celebrated. The image appeared for only a second before disappearing again. Walter sat upright in bed. His pulse quickened. He still could not place the memory. But for the first time, he became certain of one thing. Samuel Carter had not always been an old man reading books in a prison library. Somewhere beyond these walls existed a story nobody had uncovered yet. And with every passing day, that hidden story seemed closer to revealing itself. The following days brought more questions than answers. Samuel Carter continued moving through Green River exactly as he always had. He spent mornings in the library, afternoons in the recreation yard, and evenings reading quietly in his cell. Yet the closer people looked, the more unusual details they noticed. None of those details seemed important by themselves. Together, however, they formed a picture that nobody could fully explain. Early one morning, a maintenance crew worked near the gymnasium entrance. Several inmates helped move equipment while correctional officers supervised from nearby. Samuel happened to be passing through the corridor with a stack of library books tucked beneath one arm. As he approached the entrance, a heavy rolling cart drifted unexpectedly after one wheel caught a crack in the floor. The movement was not dramatic. The cart simply changed direction faster than anyone anticipated. Before the nearest worker could react, Samuel reached out and steadied it with one hand. Then he continued walking as if nothing had happened. The entire moment lasted less than 2 seconds. Most people returned to work immediately. One correctional officer did not. He watched Samuel disappear down the hallway before slowly turning back toward the cart. Something about the movement had looked effortless. Too effortless. Meanwhile, Walter Hayes spent more and more time searching his memory. Every strange thing Samuel did seemed connected to something Walter had seen long ago. The problem was that the memory remained incomplete. It felt like trying to read a book with half the pages missing. Later that afternoon, Walter visited the prison library and wandered through the small collection of old magazines stored in a forgotten corner near the back wall. He was not searching for anything specific. He simply followed instinct. One magazine after another passed through his hands. Sports, news, community publications. Most were years out of date. None seemed useful. Yet the feeling of recognition refused to disappear. Across the facility, Brandon Cole experienced a different problem. He could no longer stop watching Samuel. At first, curiosity had felt temporary. Now it had become a habit. During recreation period, Brandon noticed Samuel sitting alone beneath a shade structure reading another book. Several inmates occupied nearby tables, but Samuel remained completely absorbed in the pages before him. Brandon studied him for several minutes. The old man looked relaxed, comfortable, entirely unconcerned with the social hierarchy that dominated prison life. That confidence puzzled Brandon more than anything else. Most inmates constantly measured status. Samuel seemed untouched by the concept. Eventually, Brandon crossed the yard and stopped near the table. Samuel looked up from the book. "Good afternoon," he said. Brandon nodded. "You read a lot." Samuel smiled. "There are worse habits." Brandon pulled out a chair and sat down. Nearby conversations immediately quieted. Several inmates pretended not to watch. "What did you do before prison?" Brandon asked. Samuel closed the book and rested a finger between the pages to hold his place. "Many things." Brandon laughed. "That is not an answer." Samuel seemed amused. "It is the most accurate answer I can give." The response drew another frustrated smile from Brandon. Every conversation with Samuel felt like chasing smoke. Just when he thought he was getting closer, the answer drifted away. As evening approached, Walter finally discovered something that made his pulse quicken. Tucked inside one of the old magazine collections was a faded photograph from decades earlier. The image was partially damaged and difficult to see clearly. Yet one detail immediately caught his attention. A familiar smile. Walter leaned closer. Then closer still. The picture was too worn to reveal everything, but it revealed enough to make his heart race. For the first time, the mystery surrounding Samuel Carter no longer felt impossible to solve. Somewhere inside that faded photograph existed the first real clue. And as lights dimmed across Green River that night, Walter could think about nothing else. Walter Hayes barely slept that night. The faded photograph he had discovered remained vivid in his mind long after lights out. He could not see every detail. Time had damaged the image. The colors were faded. Part of the page had been torn. Yet one thing remained unmistakable. The man in the photograph looked remarkably similar to Samuel Carter. Not exactly the same. Decades separated the two images. Age had changed many things. But the smile, the posture, the calm confidence. Walter felt certain he was finally approaching the truth. The next morning, he returned to the library the moment it opened. The librarian watched curiously as Walter headed straight for the old magazine collection. For nearly 2 hours, he searched through archived issues. One magazine led to another. One photograph led to another. Slowly, fragments of a story began to emerge. Not enough to reveal everything. Enough to raise even bigger questions. Meanwhile, across Green River, Brandon Cole had reached a decision of his own. Curiosity was no longer satisfying him. He wanted answers. More importantly, he wanted the rest of C Block to stop treating Samuel Carter like some untouchable mystery. If Samuel would not reveal himself voluntarily, Brandon intended to create a situation that forced attention onto him. That afternoon, recreation period filled the yard with activity. Groups gathered near tables. Others walked laps around the track. Several inmates played chess beneath a shaded structure. Samuel occupied his usual bench with a library book resting open on his lap. Brandon stood near the center of the yard speaking with several followers. Then he raised his voice just enough to attract attention. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. People sensed something was about to happen. Brandon gestured toward Samuel. "There he is," he said with a grin. Several inmates immediately looked in the same direction. Samuel calmly turned another page. Brandon continued speaking. Nothing threatening, nothing aggressive. Yet the clear intention was to make Samuel the center of attention. Within minutes, dozens of eyes had shifted toward the old man on the bench. Most people expected discomfort, embarrassment, at the very least, self-consciousness. Samuel showed none of it. He simply finished reading a page and closed the book. Then he looked around the yard. "Did I miss something?" he asked. Laughter spread through the crowd. Even a few correctional officers smiled. The reaction caught Brandon off guard. He had expected nervousness. Instead, Samuel seemed completely at ease. Brandon crossed the yard and stopped beside the bench. "People are curious about you," he said. Samuel nodded. "People are curious about many things." More laughter followed. Somehow, every attempt to put pressure on him only made him appear more comfortable. Brandon folded his arms. "Do you ever get tired of answering questions with questions?" Samuel smiled. "Only when people get tired of asking them." The yard erupted again. Several inmates shook their heads in amusement. Others exchanged confused glances. The situation was unfolding in the exact opposite direction Brandon intended. Instead of becoming a joke, Samuel was becoming even more interesting. Across the yard, Walter watched the exchange while carrying a folder beneath one arm. Inside the folder rested several copied pages from the library archives. Each new discovery strengthened his suspicion. Yet one piece remained missing. One final connection he could not quite reach. As recreation period ended and inmates began returning to their housing units, Brandon stood watching Samuel walk away. The old man moved at an unhurried pace. Calm, relaxed, completely unaffected by the attention surrounding him. Walter watched too, for different reasons. Brandon wanted answers. Walter wanted confirmation. Neither man realized how close they were. Somewhere inside the archives of Green River existed a forgotten piece of history waiting to be rediscovered. And when it finally surfaced, the entire prison would understand why Samuel Carter had never needed anyone's approval in the first place. Walter Hayes arrived at the library before sunrise. The folder beneath his arm felt heavier than it should have. Inside were photocopies, notes, and fragments collected over days of searching. He spread them across a table near the back wall and studied them once again. The same face appeared repeatedly, younger, stronger, standing beneath bright lights. Yet every image carried the same calm expression Samuel Carter wore today. Walter rubbed his eyes. He was closer than ever to the truth, but one piece still refused to fall into place. Across Green River, Samuel followed his normal routine. He ate breakfast quietly, returned a library book, spent part of the morning helping another inmate understand a complicated chapter from an educational workbook. Nothing about his behavior suggested a man hiding an extraordinary past. If anything, he seemed determined to remain ordinary. That determination only deepened the mystery. Meanwhile, Brandon Cole had become increasingly frustrated. The more attention Samuel received, the less control Brandon felt over the narrative. Every attempt to place the old man in an uncomfortable position somehow produced the opposite result. Instead of embarrassment, Samuel earned admiration. Instead of becoming a target, he became a source of fascination. Brandon could not understand it. That afternoon, recreation period brought most of C Block together inside the gymnasium due to heavy rain outside. Basketballs echoed across polished floors. Card games occupied folding tables. Conversations filled the room. Samuel sat alone, near the bleachers reading as usual. Brandon noticed immediately. He exchanged a glance with several members of his group. Then an idea formed. Nothing harmful, nothing aggressive. Just another attempt to force Samuel into the spotlight. Brandon walked toward the center of the gym and picked up a small foam practice ball left near the sidelines. Several inmates looked up curiously. Brandon spun the ball in one hand and smiled. "Let us settle something," he announced. Conversation slowed. Samuel did not look up from his book. Brandon gestured toward him. "Everybody keeps talking about Samuel. So let us see if he notices anything at all." Curious faces turned toward the elderly inmate. Some laughed. Others simply watched. Brandon lightly tossed the foam ball high into the air in Samuel's direction. The throw was not dangerous. It drifted gently through the gymnasium, attracting attention from everyone nearby. Several inmates expected Samuel to be startled. Others expected him to miss it completely. Instead, something unexpected happened. Without lifting his eyes from the page, Samuel raised one hand and caught the ball cleanly. The motion looked effortless, natural, precise. He continued reading for another second before finally looking up. The gymnasium had gone strangely quiet. Samuel glanced at the ball resting in his palm. Then he smiled. "I think somebody dropped this." Laughter erupted throughout the room. Even correctional officers struggled to hide their amusement. Brandon stood frozen. The catch itself was impressive. What truly unsettled him was the timing. Samuel had reacted before most people even realized the ball was approaching. Across the gym, Walter slowly lowered the papers he had been reviewing. His heart raced. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. That was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was training. Years of training. The realization sent a chill through him. As the noise returned and activities resumed, Samuel gently tossed the ball back toward its owner and reopened his book. The moment lasted only seconds, yet everyone in the gym remembered it. More importantly, the story spread through Green River before dinner. By nightfall, inmates across multiple housing units were discussing the same question. How had a 72-year-old man wearing repaired glasses caught a moving object without even looking at it? And somewhere inside the library archives, Walter was becoming increasingly convinced that the answer existed in a forgotten chapter of Samuel Carter's life waiting to be rediscovered. By the following morning, the story had spread far beyond C Block. Inmates who had never spoken to Samuel Carter now knew about the catch in the gymnasium. Every retelling made the moment sound slightly more impressive. Some claimed he never looked up at all. Others insisted he reacted before the ball even left Brandon Cole's hand. The details changed depending on the storyteller, but the conclusion remained the same. Something about Samuel Carter was not ordinary. Samuel himself seemed completely unaffected by the attention. He spent breakfast reading a newspaper and quietly eating oatmeal. If he noticed the curious looks coming from nearby tables, he gave no indication. Across the cafeteria, Brandon watched him carefully. The frustration he once felt had transformed into something else. Respect was not the right word. Not yet. Curiosity was closer. For the first time in years, Brandon had encountered someone who could not be influenced by reputation, pressure, or public attention. That alone made Samuel unique. Meanwhile, Walter Hayes returned to the library archives with renewed determination. The photograph had given him a direction. Now he needed proof. Hours passed as he searched through old magazines and newspaper collections. Most contained nothing useful. Then, shortly after noon, he found another image. His pulse quickened immediately. The photograph showed a crowded arena filled with spectators. At the center stood a younger man wearing a calm smile despite the attention surrounding him. The caption beneath the image had faded with age, but several words remained visible. Walter leaned closer. He read the surviving text once. Then again, his hands began to tremble slightly. The memory that had been hiding for weeks suddenly moved closer to the surface. Across the prison yard, another important moment was unfolding. Recreation period had begun, and dozens of inmates gathered beneath the clear afternoon sky. Several men played cards at picnic tables. Others walked laps around the track. Samuel occupied his usual bench near the far side of the yard. A book rested in his hands. Brandon sat nearby, speaking with members of his group. Eventually, one of them nodded towards Samuel and laughed. "You know what everybody wants." Brandon looked up. "What?" "They want to see if all the stories are true." Several others nodded in agreement. Brandon glanced towards Samuel. The comment lingered in his thoughts. The entire prison seemed trapped between skepticism and belief. Some people thought Samuel was simply an unusually calm old man. Others believed he was hiding something much larger. The uncertainty had become its own kind of spectacle. As the afternoon continued, a correctional officer wheeled a cart loaded with recreational equipment across the yard. The surface near the walkway dipped slightly where years of weather had worn the pavement. One of the cart's containers shifted unexpectedly. Several lightweight training markers spilled free and scattered across the ground. The correctional officer immediately bent down to collect them. Before he could reach the nearest marker, Samuel calmly stepped forward and gathered several pieces at once. The motion itself seemed ordinary. What caught everyone's attention was the speed. Not frantic speed. Controlled speed. Efficient speed. Every movement appeared perfectly placed. No wasted effort. No hesitation. The correctional officer paused for a second. So did Brandon. So did several nearby inmates. Samuel simply handed over the markers and returned to his bench. Nothing more. Yet the moment generated another wave of discussion. By evening, conversations echoed through every corner of Green River. More signs. More questions. More curiosity. Back in the library, Walter stared at the newly discovered photograph. The answer was almost within reach now. He could feel it. Another article. Another photograph. Another forgotten record. Somewhere among those pages existed the truth about Samuel Carter. And for the first time since this mystery began, Walter became convinced that the reveal was not weeks away. It was coming very soon. Much sooner than anyone realized. The following afternoon delivered the moment everyone in Green River seemed to be waiting for. By now, Samuel Carter had become the center of countless conversations. Some inmates believed he was hiding a remarkable past. Others insisted the entire mystery had grown far beyond reality. Yet nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The old man was different. Recreation period filled the gymnasium once again. Rain tapped softly against the high windows while inmates spread throughout the building. Basketball games occupied one side of the court. Card games filled several tables. Others simply watched and talked. Samuel sat near the bleachers reading a library book. His repaired glasses rested comfortably on his face. Across the room, Brandon Cole noticed something unusual. A temporary skills demonstration had been organized as part of a recreation program. Nothing competitive. Just simple activities designed to keep inmates engaged. One station involved stacking lightweight practice discs into narrow targets from a distance. The task required patience, coordination, and focus. Most participants treated it as a joke. A few tried. Most failed. Laughter echoed throughout the gym as disc after disc bounced harmlessly away from the targets. Eventually, someone noticed Samuel sitting nearby. The suggestion came from the crowd. Let the old man try. More voices joined in. Some sounded playful. Others sounded genuinely curious. Brandon watched closely. So did Walter Hayes. Correctional officers exchanged amused glances. Samuel looked up from his book. For a moment, he appeared reluctant. Then he closed the book and stood. The gymnasium became noticeably quieter. Samuel approached the activity station while dozens of eyes followed him. A recreation supervisor handed him a small stack of practice discs. Just for fun, the supervisor said. Samuel smiled. Everything worthwhile should be. The response drew a few laughs. Samuel stepped to the marked line and looked toward the targets positioned across the floor. They were not far away, perhaps 20 feet. Still, most participants had struggled to place even one disc accurately. Samuel held the first disc loosely between his fingers. There was no dramatic preparation, no attempt to impress anyone. He simply released it. The disc traveled smoothly through the air and settled perfectly into the center target. Several inmates straightened in their seats. Samuel picked up the second disc. The result was identical. Then the third. Then the fourth. Every throw looked effortless, controlled, precise. The gymnasium gradually fell silent. Nobody laughed anymore. Even the basketball game slowed as players stopped to watch. Samuel remained completely relaxed. There was no celebration, no prideful expression, only calm concentration. When the final disc landed exactly where intended, the room stayed quiet for several seconds. Brandon stared. Walter stared. Correctional officers stared. The silence itself became the loudest reaction. Samuel looked around, slightly confused by the attention. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. Laughter finally returned, but it sounded different now. Not mocking, not dismissive, respectful. The recreation supervisor shook his head in disbelief. "No, Mr. Carter. I would say you did everything right." Samuel smiled politely and handed back the remaining equipment. Then he picked up his book and returned to his seat as though nothing remarkable had happened. Yet everyone in the gym knew they had witnessed something unusual. Not because of the game itself, because of how naturally Samuel performed it. Years of discipline seemed hidden beneath every movement. Across the room, Walter felt his pulse quicken. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The photograph, the articles, the reflexes, the precision, the calm confidence. For the first time, he no longer doubted his theory. He only needed proof. And somewhere inside the archives of Green River, he believed that proof was waiting for him. Walter Hayes entered the library with a sense of certainty he had not felt in years. For days he had followed fragments of evidence. Photographs, articles, half-forgotten memories. Now the pieces were finally beginning to align. He carried a stack of copied pages to a table near the back wall and spread them carefully beneath the overhead light. One article came from a regional newspaper nearly 40 years old. Another came from a sports magazine whose pages had yellowed with age. A third contained a photograph that stopped him cold every time he looked at it. The younger man in the image stood before a crowd, smiling calmly while reporters surrounded him. Walter stared at the face. Then he closed his eyes and pictured Samuel Carter sitting quietly in the prison library. The resemblance was undeniable. Across Green River, Samuel followed his usual routine. He returned a book, shared a brief conversation with the librarian, helped another inmate locate a history text. Nothing about his behavior suggested a man carrying an extraordinary legacy. Yet everywhere he went, people watched. The demonstration in the gymnasium had changed something. Curiosity had evolved into belief. More inmates now suspected that Samuel's past contained far more than anyone imagined. Even correctional officers occasionally exchanged knowing looks when he passed by. Later that afternoon, Walter finally discovered the breakthrough he had been searching for. Hidden inside a binder of archived newspaper clippings was a complete article. Unlike the others, this one remained perfectly preserved. The headline immediately captured his attention. He lowered himself into a chair and began reading. Within seconds, his heart started racing. The article described a nationally respected martial arts instructor whose reputation extended across multiple states. It spoke of discipline rather than competition, character rather than fame, students who became champions, communities transformed through mentorship. Walter continued reading until he reached the accompanying photograph. The younger man standing beside several trophy-winning students was unmistakably Samuel Carter. Walter sat motionless. After weeks of uncertainty, the mystery had finally cracked open. Samuel was not simply a skilled athlete. He had once been a martial arts master known far beyond his hometown. The realization left Walter speechless. Meanwhile, Brandon Cole remained unaware of the discovery. During recreation period, he sat with several members of his group, discussing the old man as usual. One inmate mentioned the gymnasium demonstration. Another recalled the catch with the foam ball. A third described Samuel's calm response when his glasses had been damaged. Brandon listened carefully. The stories no longer sounded exaggerated. They sounded connected. Every unusual moment pointed toward a single explanation. He simply did not know what that explanation was yet. As evening approached, Walter made a decision. He carried the copied article to a quiet table in the cafeteria and read it again. Then a third time. Every sentence confirmed the same truth. Samuel Carter had once trained hundreds of students. He had taught discipline, balance, patience, and self-control. More importantly, the article described him as one of the most respected martial arts instructors in the region during his era. Walter leaned back in his chair and stared toward the cafeteria entrance. A few minutes later, Samuel walked in carrying a book beneath one arm. The old man moved through the room exactly as he always had. Calm, humble, unassuming. Nobody looking at him would guess that he had once stood at the center of packed arenas and major events. Walter watched him sit alone at his usual table. For the first time since this mystery began, he no longer wondered who Samuel Carter used to be. Now he wondered why a man with such an extraordinary past had chosen to hide it from everyone around him. The revelation spread through Green River faster than any rumor in recent memory. Walter Hayes had not intended to become the messenger. Yet once the archived article was discovered, keeping its secret became impossible. By the next afternoon, copies of the faded newspaper clipping had quietly passed through multiple housing units. Inmates gathered around tables studying the photographs. Some compared the younger man in the images to the elderly inmate they saw every day in the library. Others read the article twice because they could not believe what they were seeing. The quiet old man with repaired glasses had once been one of the most respected martial arts instructors in the region. The realization changed everything. Yet the most surprising part was Samuel Carter himself. Nothing about him changed at all. While the prison buzzed with discussion, Samuel returned books, attended meals, and walked through the yard with the same calm expression he had always worn. He did not correct anyone. He did not confirm the rumors. He did not deny them either. Across the recreation yard, Brandon Cole watched the reactions unfold. Men who normally argued about sports now discussed Samuel's past. Correctional officers spoke about him during shift changes. Even inmates from other housing units seemed curious. Brandon found the situation difficult to process. For weeks he had searched for an explanation. Now he had one. Yet somehow the answer only created more questions. That evening, Brandon finally approached Samuel during recreation period. The old man sat beneath the familiar awning reading another library book. Brandon stopped beside the bench and remained silent for several seconds. Samuel eventually looked up. "Good evening," he said. Brandon nodded. "Is it true?" Samuel closed the book gently. "Which part?" Brandon almost laughed. Even now, Samuel answered questions with questions. "The articles. The photographs. All of it." Samuel looked toward the fading sunlight beyond the yard fence. For a moment, he seemed lost in memory. Then he smiled. "Some of it." Brandon sat down beside him. "People say you train champions." Samuel considered the statement. "I trained students. A lot of them became champions." Samuel nodded. "Some did." The simplicity of the answer stunned Brandon. Most people would have bragged. Most people would have told stories. Samuel spoke as though he were discussing the weather. Nearby inmates quietly watched the conversation unfold. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. The atmosphere felt different now. Respect had replaced curiosity. Finally, Brandon asked the question that had been bothering him for days. "Why never tell anyone?" Samuel looked at him for a long moment. Then he tapped the cover of the book resting in his lap. "Because chapters end." Brandon frowned. Samuel continued. "Too many people spend their lives introducing themselves with old accomplishments. I prefer to focus on who I am today." The words settled heavily between them. Brandon looked away. For the first time since arriving at Green River, he realized how much of his own identity depended on reputation. Samuel seemed completely free from that burden. As evening shadows stretched across the yard, Walter watched from a nearby table. The mystery had finally been solved, yet something even more meaningful had emerged from it. The real surprise was not that Samuel Carter had once been extraordinary. The real surprise was that he no longer needed anyone to know. And as inmates slowly returned to their housing units that night, a new understanding spread through Green River. The old man they had underestimated was not defined by the trophies he once earned or the headlines he once made. He was defined by the humility that remained after all of those things were gone. Weeks passed, yet the atmosphere inside Green River never returned to what it had been before. The mystery surrounding Samuel Carter had been solved, but the impact of that discovery continued growing. Inmates still discussed the archived articles. Some had memorized details from the newspaper clippings. Others searched for additional information whenever they could. Yet what impressed people most was not Samuel's past. It was the way he carried himself after everyone learned the truth. Nothing changed. He still spent mornings in the library. He still read during recreation periods. He still greeted people with the same quiet smile. Fame, even old fame, seemed to hold no power over him. One afternoon, Brandon Cole sat across from Samuel beneath the awning in the recreation yard. The scene would have seemed impossible only a month earlier. The man who once viewed the elderly inmate as an easy target now sought out his company voluntarily. Several inmates noticed. None found it surprising anymore. Brandon looked at the worn paperback resting in Samuel's hands. "You know," he said, "most people would have told everyone who they were." Samuel glanced up from the page. "Why?" Brandon laughed softly. "Because people like being recognized." Samuel closed the book. "Recognition is pleasant. Peace is better." The answer lingered between them. Brandon nodded slowly. In the past, he might have dismissed the comment. Now he understood it. Or at least he was beginning to. Across the yard, Walter Hayes watched the conversation with quiet satisfaction. The old mystery that had consumed him for weeks had led to something unexpected. It had changed people. Not dramatically, not overnight, but noticeably. Arguments seemed shorter. Conversations seemed calmer. More inmates spent time in the library. A few even asked Samuel for reading recommendations. The transformation was subtle, yet real. Later that evening, Samuel returned a stack of books to the library desk. The librarian smiled as he approached. "You have become quite popular around here." Samuel chuckled. "That sounds dangerous." The librarian laughed. "Not this kind." Samuel glanced around the room. Several inmates sat reading quietly at nearby tables. Others studied educational materials. The atmosphere felt peaceful. He seemed genuinely pleased by the sight. As lights out approached, Brandon walked through the housing unit and noticed something he had never paid attention to before. Respect earned through fear disappeared the moment fear vanished. Respect earned through character lasted much longer. Samuel had never demanded admiration. He had never asked for attention. Yet somehow he possessed more influence than anyone else in Green River. The realization stayed with Brandon long after he returned to his cell. That night, as the prison gradually settled into silence, Samuel sat on the edge of his bunk reading beneath the dim light available before final count. The repaired glasses still rested on his face. The same glasses that had started everything. The same glasses many people now remembered as the beginning of a story nobody expected. Samuel turned one final page and smiled quietly to himself. Across the facility, inmates who once ignored him now carried lessons they would remember long after their sentences ended. Walter had found the truth he was searching for. Brandon had discovered a different understanding of strength. And Green River had learned that greatness often arrives without announcements, titles, or recognition. Sometimes it sits alone in a cafeteria. Sometimes it reads quietly in a library corner. Sometimes it wears repaired glasses and says very little. The remarkable part is not how often people overlook it. The remarkable part is how unforgettable it becomes once they finally see it.